Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again today. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. It is Thursday, October 24th. It's 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And on deck, we've got our infamous Freight Market Roundup. Now, if this is the first time joining us, welcome to our ship show. My name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And if you have not heard of us before, I think the simplest way to put it is we are a full service, end-to-end transportation and inventory management organization. And, I like to say that whether you're shipping around the block or you're shipping around the globe, we not only can handle it, but we can at least have the experience to show you the very best way to do it. So you're doing it most effectively. It's really never been a better time to reach out to us and learn more. Go to our website, check it out. We just actually ran through the whole thing and had it redone. It is scSolutionsinc.com. Check it out. You can learn more about us and you can reach out to us as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is our Freight Market Roundup, or FMR for short. It is a broad stroke view of the shipping market from a U.S. viewpoint. So today, we're going to run through what our customers are currently paying in terms of ocean rates, air rates, but also we're going to talk about some of the current events that are affecting our teams as well as our customers. We try to keep these episodes under 15 minutes. Occasionally, when we have guests on here, it can go a little bit longer. But if this isn't a good time for you to listen, you can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and so much more. Listen to us on your ride home or while you're cooking dinner. So with all that out of the way, let's dive right in. Let's start with those ocean rates. And remember, this is just the ocean rate. We're not talking about destination to destination. We're talking about port to port here. So let's start with the Trans-Pacific lane. And we're going to focus on shipments that are coming out of the Southeast Asian region and China and headed into the U.S. West Coast ports. Now, if you've been with us these last few weeks, we really expected this lane to slightly increase following Golden Week. But lo and behold, the team and I were really surprised to find them actually dropping in price. And this slight drop is really especially surprising when you consider all of the current congestion that's being dealt with at LA, Los Angeles, and Long Beach right now. So currently, our customers are paying an average of around $5,200 per 40-foot container, which, as a reminder, we refer to those as FEUs, or 40-foot equivalent units. Now, this is slightly down from the rates we were seeing of about $5,400 at the end of September. Now, let's shift gears. Let's look at shipments that are still leaving China and Southeast Asia, but now I want to look at the ones heading into the U.S. East Coast ports. So we're seeing the exact same trend, actually. The average cost for our customers coming into the U.S. East Coast ports is around $5,600 per FEU. That's also headed down, and this is despite the congestion we're dealing with over there as well. Now, let's focus on the U.S. East Coast ports quick. Let's talk about kind of a comparison point. Just days before our October 1st strike, we were seeing rates as high as $6,800. So right now, we're seeing rates at $5,600. Right before the strike, we were seeing prices as high as $6,800. Now, there is a very big caveat we have to mention here because it's really important to note that $6,800 was prices we were seeing, but we were also seeing certain carriers offer these bullet rates. They were doing the exact opposite of the price trend, and they were offering these really steep discounts right before the strike began for shipments that were heading into the U.S. East Coast. Now, there is, on the surface with these rates, because there was surcharge and congestion charges that came about, part of the pricing strategy from these carriers has been kind of theorized to be, well, they're going to give you the cheaper rate to get you on the boat, but as soon as it arrives, you're going to get hit with that congestion surcharge, which were very hefty. We'll discuss those in a bit, but let's continue on. I want to wrap up the Trans-Pacific before moving on to the Transatlantic, and then we'll get into the current events. So wrapping up the Trans-Pacific, let's talk about still containers coming out of Southeast Asia and China. But now I want to talk about them headed into the Mexican West Coast. Currently, these shipments, we're seeing rates just shy of the $4,000 per FEU price point. And, this is actually slightly lower than what we were seeing just before Golden Week holiday as well. But, it's almost deceptive saying it's slightly lower because, quite frankly, it's pretty much in line. I mean, we're talking about $30 lower. So keep that in mind. Let's move on. Let's go to the transatlantic, leave the Trans-Pacific behind us. So I want to focus on shipments that are leaving European ports that are headed into the US East Coast. Since the start of October, the shipments that were leaving European ports and headed into the US East Coast, they saw this crazy increase in price. Obviously, this happened, well, really not the start of October, but really during September into October. At the end of September, we saw the price point average coming in at around $2,300 per FEU. But, since the strike, we saw that price bump up all the way up to the $3,000 per FEU price point. And really, it has held that point extremely firmly. Now, as I mentioned, congestion, surcharge, fees, we have to kind of discuss this, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's kind of continue on. Let's still focus on what our customers are paying currently for shipments that are leaving European ports, but instead of heading into the US East Coast, now let's talk about the ones heading into the US West Coast. And right now we're seeing rates at the $4,300 per 40-foot equivalent unit, which has honestly also been extremely stable since the strike started back on October 1st. Let's finish this off. Let's talk about the final lane we like to discuss. These are shipments coming out of China and coming out of Southeast Asia, but in the past, they used to head through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Obviously, that's not been happening because of those regional issues. But, this is as soon as we can find some stability in that region, which I think, as everyone knows right now, is going to be a little bit further out than we were hoping for. But we'll be going back to that point. Now, and really, this story of what we've been seeing with the rates is continuing with this lane as well. Despite this lane being substantially longer than it normally is, we are seeing a very stable price point. It's coming in at about $2,500 per FEU, which is an absolute bargain for this lane. You've got so many stops. Obviously, it's wild that it can be priced that low, and it's stayed that low. We've booked numerous times with our customers at right around that price. So pretty impressive. Now, that's our ocean market. That's what we're seeing right now for rates for our customers in the major lanes we like to discuss here. But I want to quick talk about some of the big events we're seeing in the marketplace before we move on to talking about the air freight rates. So let's talk about that congestion surcharge. And actually, it is some great news. So those surcharges that were implemented by almost all the carriers going into the US East Coast, they have almost all but been dropped. I actually think at this point, every single one of them has been dropped. I have not seen an invoice go out that actually has that congestion surcharge on it in the past week. And they started dropping off actually as soon as October 11th. Now, this was such a big point of contention because, really for the shipping community, we're trying to support our customers through what's been an extremely rocky couple of years. And then you add in all of these disruptions and all of these just price fluctuations after COVID is well behind us from a disruption standpoint. And it's very challenging. Now we've got this massive line item coming in for customers that are just kind of finding their rhythm again for shipping and in a market that's been much more challenging. So this was also an area where the shipping community in general was very frustrated. Not to get on a soapbox too much, but the FMC kind of with their newfound teeth from the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, pretty much banned demurrage and detention during strikes. But then out of the blue, what do you have? A surcharge congestion fee, essentially making up for that lost revenue. I hate to call it revenue, but quite frankly, it's kind of what it is. Now, we had no idea when it would drop off. We knew if the strike lasted a full week, we'd be seeing 4 to 5 weeks worth of congestion afterwards. And, the worst possible predictions were, will we see this congestion surcharge fee for that entire time? Obviously, we had the strike last for 3 days, thankfully. Still have our eyes on January when it comes to this new contracts or this new extensions expiration. And, we just really didn't know. So hearing that these fees were getting dropped was a huge relief for us in the community. And it really seems that we have, the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, to thank for this. He put quite a bit of pressure on the carriers to drop the charges. It was received relatively well by the carriers. But, if you want to go through what some of these carriers were asking for, it was wild. So, for example, Ocean Network Express, one, as it's referred to, they announced a congestion surcharge of up to $2,000 per FEU headed into the US East Coast. And if you look at the rates at the time, that actually represented more than a 66% increase on their base shipping rate for those containers, which is just absolutely wild. Just, gosh. Anyway, so fantastic news. Glad that's behind us. Obviously, all sites on January 15th right now. We really need to make sure that those negotiations are hitting the right point where actually both sides can kind of find what they're willing to agree on. There was a study just completed by the USMX that said just what they've agreed to so far, the 62% increase in wages is going to result in more than $5 billion worth of costs. Now, I'll discuss this a little bit more next week. We've got a special show actually next week with one of our partners. We're really excited about it. But in the coming weeks, I'll kind of bring that up. So anyway, let's move on. Let's move over to West Coast ports. Now, you remember before the strike happened, there was a lot of shippers moving over the West Coast, and we were also urging some of our customers to move over the West Coast. The rail lines made it very clear they were not going to fall into the same pitfalls of the past. They were so prepared. BNSF had been, upgrading their network entirely. You had Union Pacific that was talking about, they were boasting about all of the equipment they had placed. They were ready. They were ready for, containers to come into the West Coast ports. Well, that was definitely a little bit of an overstatement. So I think just the fact they made it so exceptionally clear that they were ready, and then we are just having so much congestion right now in LA, in Long Beach, is just it's just absolute irony. It's hilarious. It's beyond irony. But anyway, so there's a couple things here we have to discuss. So obviously they kind of came out and said, hey, we're ready. Well, September was a very busy month for the West Coast ports. If you just look at the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, in just focus on them, they handled 874,730 TEUs in the month, 20-foot equivalent units. Now, you don't have any context for that number, so you really don't understand how big that is. That is the record for the amount of containers they've handled in a month ever. That even beat out October of 2022. That was this COVID-influenced just surge in imports. I mean, we discussed this in length back then, but what was happening with the ocean market was wild and completely irregular, and beating October 2022. While we see growth every year, still, that was such an outlier. We were not expecting to beat it that soon. So this is extremely impressive that they handled that many containers. Now, just be careful not to take this, though, as a broad statement on the state of the U.S. economy and imports in general, because really, you have to remember, why was September so busy? A massive shift away from the U.S. East Coast and Gulf Coast ports and going into the West Coast. And this is really because the ILA was so public about their threat to strike, and the months leading up were also very clear that the chance of a deal getting made was almost out the window. A lot of the shippers took notice, and a lot of the shippers made changes, and a lot of them switched over more than ever before, more than we've seen. In particular, when you consider the ILWU shifting over to the U.S. East Coast ports, which they also dealt with a substantial amount of congestion, the threat here and the unprecedented nature of the ILA striking and the reality that it was probably going to happen really made people move, which was fantastic. Obviously fantastic that the shipping community was willing to have that flexibility. In some situations you have to pay more, but to avoid some of that disruption, to have more fluidity in your network, it really does pay off. And actually it has so far. We'll discuss that in a minute. But, what we are seeing here is just that unprecedented shift, breaking the peak volume in a month ever for the LA, for the Long Beach and Los Angeles port. But we now need to talk about what the fallout is. So during September, let's talk about dwell times. Specifically, when you look at containers that left just LA and Long Beach by truck, or specifically road, they hit the highest level of dwell time since October of 2023. So that average dwell time was 3.21 days. The port basically came out and said, trucks aren't the problem. So in contrast, let's talk about rail. Containers leaving by rail had an average dwell time of 9.25 days. And that's pretty bad. Beyond that, the month before, August, was 8.2 days. That's also pretty bad. Both of those were record highs in dwell times since November of 2022. So my question is, How prepared were you? Through August and September, we had record dwell times. We'll just set that out there and we'll move on. But the most common question we're getting from our customers right now is, okay, so there is a lot of congestion happening in Los Angeles and Long Beach. Obviously, we're still managing throughput decently well, but how is this going to affect me going forward? Am I going to have issues shipping into the West Coast for the next couple of months? And the answer to this question actually comes out of a little bit of an unlikely place, but the National Retail Federation. So CEO Matthew Shaw, he announced that retailers across the board have done an excellent job this year in terms of inventory management, in terms of forward stocking inventory, and they're finding themselves with the most balanced inventory to sales ratio they have really ever seen, actually all the way back to 2018. Now, currently the ratio is sitting at a 1.1, and that is not actually considered ideal for retail broadly across the board. But if you factor in the projections for this holiday season being a little lower, just given a lot of other factors, which we're not going to discuss today, it's almost a hedge on a bet, if that makes sense. So a little bit lower than retail generally likes to see, but a 1.1 is extremely balanced. So very, very interesting. And the expectation is that because of this forward stocked inventory, while generally in a year there is room for more inventory, we're not really expecting as much of a surge as we've seen prior to the pandemic. So let's wrap it up there. We're actually going a little bit overtime. Let's quick touch on the air freight market and let's get you guys on with the rest of your day. So our air freight market right now, our customers that are shipping into the US from China between all origins and destination, we are seeing them pay on the low end $5.88 a kilo. And then on the high end, we're seeing a cost of $6.72 a kilo. The weighted average we're seeing is right around $6.43. Anyway, really appreciate you guys joining us today. We've got a fantastic show next week. We've got our partner on Sourcing Insights. We're going to run through their software, Sourcing Shark. It is something that's helped so many of our clients already to date, and we're trying to introduce them to more. It helps us more effectively manage our customers' inventory, and at the same time, in a year where it's good to kind of lean out a little bit, well, that's kind of their bread and butter. So anyways, meet us next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern time. It's been great being able to have you guys here. Thanks again, and make it a great week.